One of the biggest debates in Formula 1 today is about runoffs, and circuits today often have excessive amounts of... one-offs. Sorry. Formula 1 has had a number of one-hit wonders over the years, but in this ultra-professional era, drivers emerging for a solitary race are as rare as a Monaco overtake. Let's take a moment to hark back to some of the more memorable one-off entries in Formula 1's history, and the drivers who made something of an impact on the sport before fading out as quickly as they arrived. A disclaimer, we're only counting race starts here. DNQs, DNPQs, and DNSs simply won't count. One of the most colourful teams ever to grace the Formula 1 grid, both literally and metaphorically, Jordan got through its fair share of drivers during its early years in Formula 1. Mired in the lower midfield during 1993, Formula 1 veterans Ivan Capelli and Thierry Boutsen struggled to match rookie Rubens Barrichello at the team. Team boss Eddie Jordan shifted his sights towards youth and delved into Formula 3000 for a replacement. Italian driver Marco Paciello was brought into the fold for his home race at Monza. A frontrunner in Japanese Formula 3000, Paciello flew back home to participate in his first Grand Prix just a week after racing at Fuji. Although Paciello only qualified 23rd, it was still a successful session, and by the end of Saturday's running was just half a second off of Barrichello's best lap. But then that all proved to be irrelevant, and at the start of the Italian Grand Prix, Sauber's JJ Leto ended up starting unexpectedly at the back of the grid and tried to make a quick getaway, but as early as the first corner he careened into the pair of Jordans, putting both out on the spot. Taking the distance from 23rd on the grid to the scene of his retirement before the first chicane, Paciello's Formula 1 career lasted, plus 20, carry the one, a grand total of 800 metres. It's better than nothing. A three-time 24 Hours of Le Mans winner, Andre Lotterer's CV also boasts a Formula Nippon title and 2 Super GT titles. With that pedigree, it's a bit of a travesty that he never got a fair crack at Formula 1. 2 years spent at Jaguar as its test driver at the turn of the millennium came to nothing, but 12 years later another team dressed in green came calling. In 2014, Caterham was circling the drain. After former owner Tony Fernandez had pulled his support, the team now sought alternate revenue streams. Along came Hype Energy, a long-time F1 sponsor, which offered a one-time payment of around £250,000 to the team if it would put Lotterer in for the Belgian Grand Prix, in place of Kamui Kobayashi. The team duly obliged, and Lotterer made a surprise debut at Spa-Francorchamps at the age of 32. But immediately the German was on the pace of teammate Marcus Ericsson, out-qualifying him by over a second in a wet session to start 21st. Unfortunately for Lotterer, that was as good as it got. Although he rose as high as 18th at the end of the first lap, his car suddenly lost power at the start of the second, and he had to retire. Lotterer was offered the seat for the next race at Monza, but on the condition that he would have to give up the seat for Roberto Merri in FP1. Feeling he needed the seat time to truly be competitive, Lotterer wisely declined, handing the keys back to Kobayashi and ultimately ending his short-lived F1 career. After all, a career at the back of an F1 grid, it's a bit of a lottery. Is this the most eventful one-off performance ever? After Spiker driver Christian Albers ran out of money midway through 2007, he was given the chop ahead of the European Grand Prix. In came test driver Markus Winkelhock, son of ex-F1 driver Manfred, to fill the breach at the Nürburgring. As Spiker was 2007's designated backmarker team, Winkelhock was resigned to starting at the back, some way off of teammate Adrian Suttil's overall pace, but an almost sudden turnaround in weather conditions meant that was perhaps to Winkelhock's advantage. On the warm-up lap, the skies suddenly heaved with imminent rain, and Spiker made the wild call to bring in Winkelhock before the start, for a set of wet tyres in anticipation. It proved to be a masterstroke, and by the time the field wound its way to the final few corners of the first lap, the track was already wet. The rest of the field poured into the pits, leaving Winkelhock out in the lead by the end of lap 2 with a very healthy gap. Winkelhock maintained his lead into a safety car period and an eventual red flag after numerous cars aquaplaned into the gravel at turn 1. The good fortune ended there, and on the restart, the Spiker driver was swallowed up by the field, as his second wet tyre gamble failed to pay off as the circuit dried. His hydraulics packed up at the end of lap 14, ending Winkelhock's day in the sun. Sakon Yamamoto took the reins for the rest of the season, but his somewhat lengthier stint with the team was far less dramatic. A man of many disciplines, Sarrazin has raced just about everything you can think of. From rallying, to endurance, to Formula E, he's done it all. But Formula 1? Although Sarrazin spent a very long time as Prost Grand Prix test and reserve driver, he only ever raced a Formula 1 car in anger once, with Minardi. After a testing crash in which he injured his hand, regular Minardi driver Luca Badoer was on the recovery table for the Brazilian Grand Prix, the second race of the 1999 season. Minardi drafted in Sarrazin, with the permission of Prost of course, to partner Marc Genet. Sarrazin was up to speed in no time, and before long he was faster than Genet. On Saturday he even outqualified the two Arrows cars, to start the race from an impressive 17th. Starting well, Sarrazin got ahead of Williams driver Alex Zanardi, but went straight on at the first chicane and lost all of the ground he'd made up. But Sarrazin fought his way back up to 11th before a front wing failure threw him spectacularly into the barrier at turn 14, in which he spun multiple times in a cloud of smoke. Regardless, Minardi was massively impressed with the French driver and wanted to keep him on. But Prost promised him a seat for the 2000 season if he remained with his team, a promise that never even materialised. In 1988, McLaren won all but one Grand Prix, and that kind of began when Williams' Nigel Mansell contracted chickenpox. Racing against doctors' orders in Hungary, Mansell rather exacerbated the problem. Martin Brundle had to step in for the Belgian Grand Prix, but sports car commitments precluded him from doing Monza as well. In stepped Brundle's sports car rival Jean-Louis Schlesser, back for another bite of the F1 cherry 5 years after failing to qualify for the 1983 French Grand Prix with the RAM team. In the Judd-powered Williams, Schlesser was slow at Monza, qualifying a lowly 22nd, but at least he made it onto the grid this time. With 3 laps to go, race leader Ayrton Senna came up to lap Schlesser, with Ferrari pair Michele Alboreto and Gerhard Berger bearing down on him. Schlesser opened the door for Senna at the first part of the chicane, but locked up and attempted to make the next part of the corner, punting Senna off and letting the Ferrari duo trickle through. It became a fitting win for Ferrari, as it was the first Italian Grand Prix since Enzo Ferrari's death, and ultimately remained McLaren's only blemish that season, as Senna retired with damage. Although Ferrari was ultimately gifted that victory, without Schlesser's intervention the team wouldn't have been able to win at all. So in that regard, an inherited win was the Schlesser of two evils. Hang on, Tiff Needell, as in the ex-Top Gear host Tiff Needell. Before moving on to present TV shows in arguably more sensible cars, Tiff Needell was once an F1 driver. Taking the tried and tested 1970s path in motorsport through Formula Ford, ably assisted by his Lotus 69 FF that he won in an Autosport magazine contest, and British Formula 3, Needell moved into the British Formula 1 series. Getting to the main F1 stage, Needell's eventual debut in 1980 came under unfortunate circumstances, after Clay Regazzoni, then driving for Enzin, was paralysed in a crash with Riccardo Zannino at Long Beach, and this left an unfortunate vacancy in the driving lineup. Needell got the call-up, making his debut at the following Belgian Grand Prix, held then at Zolder. Crucially, Needell managed to get himself into the race by qualifying 23rd, sharing the final row of the grid with two-time champion Emerson Fittipaldi. But Needell's career in Formula 1 lasted just 12 laps, as his normally reliable Cosworth DFE gave up the ghost while running in 19th place. He had one more tilted Grand Prix next time out at Monaco, but didn't qualify, having struggled to get near a competitive time. Although Needell's F1 career didn't work out, his later dalliances with rallycross, touring cars and TV bore more fruit. Overall, Tiff can't be too miffed. Perhaps the most madcap entry on this list, literally and figuratively, considering the individual's headwear of choice, Hans Heyer is technically a didn't qualify entrant. But he started an F1 Grand Prix anyway. It was the 1970s after all, it was a different time. A multiple disciplines specialist with a range of touring car titles, Hans Heyer was offered a call-up to race in F1 by the ATS team, then a Penske customer, in the 1977 German Grand Prix at Hockenheim. Heyer wasn't quick enough in qualifying, only setting the 27th quickest time overall. Only the 24 fastest cars would make it to the grid. No matter, Heyer presumably thought, he was going to race anyway. Having become acquainted with the Hockenheim marshals over the years, he persuaded them to let him out of the pits and onto the grid, while race stewards were preoccupied with a start light glitch. Managing to completely bypass the race officials, Haya got as far as lap 10 into the race before a gear linkage failed. Only then did the stewards notice that he'd raced illegally, disqualifying him from a DNQ and a DNF. He went down in history as the only man to get a DNQ, a DSQ and a DNF. Haya's appearance on the F1 grid would be unthinkable today, as the level of grid security was undoubtedly raised even higher. We've had a little bit of fun on this list, but we'd like to end this on a more serious note. While the other 7 had slightly more unorthodox stamps on Formula 1, Ratzenberger's story is a little bit more sombre. After appearances in touring cars, sports cars and F3000, Ratzenberger made it to Formula 1 at the relatively late age of 33, with the Simtech team in 1994 after paying for the first 5 races. Failing to qualify for the Brazil season opener, Ratzenberger scraped onto the grid at Aida, as the 2 Pacific cars didn't make the grade at its namesake Grand Prix. He finished 11th, albeit last. But that was Ratzenberger's only start in Formula 1 before the events at Imola unfolded in the worst possible manner. Sustaining a catastrophic front wing failure, Ratzenberger sadly perished partway through qualifying. He should have had at least one more start. His fastest lap was good enough for 26th on the grid, beating Paul Belmondo by 3/10. Belmondo was offered the vacant berth on the grid, but ultimately declined out of respect.